Now, you could argue, well, maybe population goes up when revenues go up, and then population goes down when revenues go down. That's not really great, right? Because it's getting at that same issue, and that there's always going to be a cap in the types of amenities Alaska can offer. That doesn't come from the demand for those amenities. It comes from oil prices and the performance of the permanent fund.
Welcome to the East Anchorage Book Club podcast. I'm your host, Andrew Gray. Today on the show, we have University of Alaska Anchorage economics professor Kevin Berry. Whether you know him from his spicy Twitter account or his thought-provoking op-eds in the Anchorage Daily News, Kevin Berry has become one of the more well-known economists in Alaska. Today's conversation is wide-ranging, and I hope just the first of many. Kevin Berry, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having me.
Tell us a little bit about yourself. Where did you grow up?
So I'm kind of from all over. I was born in Long Island, New York. We were there until I was like 8. We moved to Denver for a while. Then I went to undergraduate and graduate school at the University of Wyoming. So I was there for about 9 years between my PhD and my bachelor's degree. And then I met my wife in graduate school. And so we kind of spent a bunch of time everywhere between Laramie, Wyoming and New Haven, Connecticut, while I was a postdoc for about a year and a half at Yale. And then I came up here. We've been up here for about 5 years.
And what was the driver to come up here?
So my wife is from Anchorage. She's actually an East High alum. And so the academic market is really weird. Oftentimes a job will come up once or twice in your entire career. And so if you want to go to a place, you kind of make the choice very quickly of this is where I want to be or pass, and knowing it'll never come up again. And so it was my first year at Yale out of a 2-year postdoc. The job at UAA came up. And I was curious because we'd been up for a wedding. We'd been up in the summer. It was June. It was perfect. And I was like, well, let's take a look and see. It's best to have the option and turn it down later. And then I met the faculty at UAA, and there was a core of young economists doing exciting research that were pulling in grant funding and teaching exciting classes and doing some things that I had not thought of before. Like it was a much more project-based and empirical type degree. And so I was excited to join and come up here and yeah. Been here ever since.
And you're an environmental economist?
Yeah, so I'm an environmental and resource economist, and a lot of what I do is called applied theory, which makes me a little bit of an odd duck as far as the rest of the field. Most of my colleagues right now do a lot of very empirical stuff, and I'm more of the theorist in the group.
I would think that Alaska would be a good fit for an environmental economist, just with fish and climate change and, that sort of stuff happening at an accelerated rate here.
Absolutely. And we built a department, I think, at this point that's very focused on resource, use problems, fisheries management, non-renewable resources like oil and mining, and people are interested in what's broadly called applied micro, which is very policy-focused research. So, for instance, there's that wave of papers from Musinga Tabi, Matt Reimer, Andrew Bibler, and Brett Watson, and I think now Mary Capriva is writing some of them on the PFD, and looking at the impacts of that universal cash transfer and what it does to different economic variables and stuff, like labor force participation or crime rates and stuff like that. And so as a field, I think we're really well placed for people who are interested, or as a department, we're really well placed for people who are interested in policy questions and things that are relevant to Alaska. And one of the neat things that we've run into is I think everybody we wind up recruiting is either very excited about Alaska and wants to live here for recreation and amenity value and because it's an amazing place to be, or they're also simultaneously very interested in the policy issues in the state and sort of where they can weigh in and do fun stuff research-wise.
So I'm going to dive right in. One thing that people who know you probably know you because you're pretty active on Twitter.
Yeah.
You've also written a lot of op-eds that have appeared in ADN. You have one that looks like it comes out every 2 or 3 months about like that. And so you have a recent tweet, speaking of an oil-based economy. Your recent tweet was that high gas prices will lead to rapid decarbonization. You also followed up by, I think you had a tweet that said something like about not caring that much about whether oil companies make a profit or not, or I might say it wrong, but
I'm not hung up on whether or not oil companies are making massive profits or not. And I think it's funny because Twitter, it limits you to 140 characters, and so I get teased sometimes by people. Like, I'm very good at kicking the hornet's nest. I'm not very good at getting people to understand what I'm saying. So in that particular tweet, for instance, I'm not worried if oil companies are making high profits or low profits, right? They're private companies that are selling a product that's in demand. And there certainly weren't a lot of people who were crying when they were making losses during the pandemic, right? Now people want to come back around because they're making a ton of money, but we should think about in the long run, is this all sort of evening out? Are they making large profits now because they were making losses before? And then also, of course, Alaska has a complicated relationship with oil companies, right? Oil revenue pays a large chunk of our state budget. It's a big part of our private sector economy. The employment is important, particularly for communities like Anchorage, where oil jobs are a big deal. And so I guess what I was getting at is I think it's interesting when people throw a fit over the amount of profit being made in any particular quarter, right? Because in the long run, prices are volatile. They go up and they go down, and it's difficult to tell where they're going to wind up. And I don't think that metric is a good one to get worked up about. And then, my second part was also, I find very interesting the trade-off, I find really interesting the sort of cognitive dissonance between people who are obviously concerned with climate change. We're in a state that is experiencing rapid climate change. We are sort of at the forefront of it. And want rapid decarbonization and movement to electric vehicles and movement away from non-renewables. But at the same time, they're unexcited about high oil prices because they have to pay for gas and they have to pay for fuel, right? Because that's the trade-off. Mm-hmm. The decarbonization would happen because renewables and electrics are getting cheaper relative to non-renewables. That's what's going to get most of us to switch. And so like the classic economic policy is a carbon tax. And a carbon tax is the same as making energy prices higher. Mm-hmm. That's the point, is it gets people to substitute away from those more expensive things to cheaper things like electric cars and renewables. And so to me, it's a little funny to watch people simultaneously be angry about high gas prices and then also want people to shift away to renewables. But this is a mechanism that will encourage that change. And it's a response to market things that oil companies can't control as well. And it's our neighbors' jobs, and it pays for our schools. And so I think it's a very complicated relationship. But watching social media, right, it's made for sort of quick takes and not thought out policy positions. And so I just wanted to poke the hornet's nest and point out that people weren't being super consistent with their concerns.
Well, I think we don't have a lot of electric vehicles in Alaska right now.
That's true.
And we don't really have the infrastructure to drive an electric vehicle from Anchorage to Fairbanks. So the bottom line is if you want to drive to work right now, if you want to drive to Fairbanks, you're going to have to buy gas. So I definitely can see where you're going with this would make an electric vehicle more attractive to somebody just in a purely economic sense. But at the same time, we're not really ready for that.
I think you bring up a really great point there too, which is also when we talk about decarbonization and fighting climate change, right? We don't necessarily need to be talking about Alaska first. We are probably one of the higher cost places on the planet to decarbonize. We're energy intensive and we're cold. So like electric vehicles as well potentially have range loss because of cold weather. And so it doesn't necessarily make sense for us to be on the front lines. It makes a lot more sense to push rapid decarbonization and movement to electric vehicles in California and be less pushy with things in Alaska where it's more expensive and more difficult. And I think that this is also another thing where I've kicked the hornet's nest once or twice, right? Where if we think about how renewables play a role in the Alaskan economy, one of the things that people are often very against is mining, for instance, because of potential environmental impacts. And I'm not talking about any specific mine or any specific infrastructure. Obviously, things should go through permitting processes, and permitting processes should be real and honest and fair and quick enough that we can move on, right? Get a decision and either develop a prospect or not. But if we think about renewable energy and what part of the value chain Alaska is in, it's probably not manufacturing. Because all the things that make manufacturing up here difficult to begin with still apply for solar panels and everything else. But it is potentially mining and minerals that go into those things. Bob Loeffler and Brett Watson just had a great Talk of Alaska podcast where they talked a lot about critical minerals in Alaska and the opportunities. And they had a recent ICER report that if anybody's interested in this topic, I'd suggest taking a look at. Just sort of the cost of permitting and being friendly or less friendly to industry, and the potential for the development of mining jobs in Alaska where we can play a role in global decarbonization and fighting climate change in a way that's not making it impossible to drive to Fairbanks.
Right. Well, our state's income is it's really a small percentage that's coming from minerals.
Yep.
And what that industry would tell you is that the cost of the infrastructure to get to the mine and to actually mine the minerals is so high that they can't really afford for much tax or I guess royalty payment to the state. And therefore, in order to keep it competitive, it's a very similar argument as what the oil companies give, that they need these incentives in order to be able to drill here because it's so expensive. But
there's a trade-off, right? I mean, I think every industry, I think, makes the same argument. We shouldn't just pick on minerals, right? Every industry, all things equal, would prefer help rationally, right? But I do think you raise an interesting point that we often have to question how much of a risk we're willing to take in foregone development, and it's not certain up front, right? So if we remove things like incentives for oil companies and raise their taxes, we can expect them to invest less, all things equal, probably. And so we have to ask ourselves that question of how quickly are they going to be pulling out of Alaska anyway? Are there developments that we believe are in the pipeline, and are those developments going to be impacted by changes to taxes? And the same thing, with mineral development or anything else. And, we don't know, it's uncertain, and our policy leaders, I think, have to make a choice, and they have to either convince us it's the right one or demonstrate it's the right one. But I do think that that's up for debate. I think, honestly, I don't know that anybody knows for certain whether or not, say, a marginal change in oil tax credits is really going to change development prospects in the state. It could, in which case, depending on how quickly oil revenue goes away, that could be a big deal for Alaska. If they were leaving anyway, it may not make a big difference. And so I think, to me, I don't know, I come back to I like to think the best of most people. I think it's worth open conversations with industry and their representatives, and open conversations about how much revenue and how we structure things to really think about those trade-offs, those potential costs. I don't think any of these things have an easy silver bullet or one button that we can just press that fixes them.
So I attended a forum with the mineral people recently. And one thing that they were hoping that the state government could do is they were concerned about the high cost of housing, and how when they have workers coming in to work on these mines, that the cost of housing is so high that it basically eats into, or it makes it, they have to pay more. It's just, so they're like, the state's got to do something so that we have lower cost housing. I'm like, well, I'm all on board for lower cost housing, but it seems like you're saying that you absolutely cannot pay anything additional to the state, but you want the state to really get on board to kind of help you lower your costs. And so I feel like there's something a little bit mismatched there.
So were they talking about in Anchorage or statewide?
No, all statewide.
I mean, I think particularly when it comes to housing. So, I mean, I obviously have preferences, right? Like, I'm not going to pretend that I'm completely non-biased politically. I'm pro market and freedom stuff in general, and helping people as well. That's important. But I think that there's choices that the state can make that involve making less decisions about what industries and what things we support. And so things like trying to push affordable housing, which to me is closer to infrastructure and an input into the production process, right? It involves less information. So say you make housing cheaper in Anchorage for folks who work in the mineral industry and oil. A nice side effect is that housing is cheaper for everybody else. And so if it turns out that aerospace or transportation is the future, then housing is still cheaper for people in transportation. And if we're talking about in rural Alaska, right, which has, dramatic housing shortages and issues with housing quality and housing affordability, I think sort of the same story. If the initial motivation is making housing cheaper for folks so they can come work in mineral development and mines at Red Dog or whatever, wherever we happen to be talking about, but it also makes housing cheaper and higher quality for everybody else in those communities, we can think about that as more general infrastructure and not necessarily a gift to the company, but a gift to not even a gift, right? It's a function of the state. It's the state working for the folks who work in those communities. And that kind of stuff I think is valuable, because one of the most difficult things you can ask any sort of economic planner or leader to do, I think, is to pick winners over the next decade or two. I don't think anybody has a really perfect idea of what industry is going to be the next big thing. if we're going to discover resources, or if there's going to be a sudden innovation in some industry, or if we're going to shift all to services. I don't know. I don't think anybody else. I think a lot of people have good ideas, but I don't think anybody knows for certain.
So my very basic understanding of economics is that if you want to lower the cost of something and increase the supply, so if we want to lower the cost of housing, we need to increase the supply.
I mean, I think that's one button to push, and it's, to me, the most obvious.
Are there other buttons to push?
We can try various policy issues. There's some evidence that, for instance, short-term rentals can push up the price of housing. And so people have made a lot of noise going back to Twitter, where we know each other from originally, right? That Airbnb is driving up housing prices. And on the margin, it probably is. But there's a lot of other things that play a role. And some of it is the number of households potentially increasing, changes post-pandemic, and who's shopping for houses. Changes in the housing market are likely influencing the rental market too. If people aren't able to move out of rentals into that first home that they own, that sort of becomes a bottleneck of getting out of the rental market, which raises rents as everybody has to compete higher. But the simplest button to me is often to figure out how to build more houses. Like single family home construction has been lagging in the state. It's not that there's none of it, but it has slowed down. And if we want to lower the price of a good, having more of it will do it. And if we're worried too about places like short-term rentals driving up the price, right? Competing away those profits and making it a bad investment will convince people to stop converting their homes to Airbnbs and sell instead, or make it long-term rentals. One of the issues I think that we're facing is that Alaska is an awesome place to live, but it's also an awesome place to visit. And the folks who want to come visit have a lot of money to spend for a couple days in an Airbnb. And they're competing with folks who are looking for a year-round home and don't necessarily have the same amount of money. I think we need to figure out ways to build more houses in Alaska. And I think this is, again, another one of those conversations where industry, can explain a lot of the things that are holding them back. And there's potentially room for the state or the municipality to work with them to try and encourage development.
So one thing that you just mentioned was increase in number of households, which seems a little counterintuitive since we know that we've been losing people. So can you explain that? Yeah,
so it's a change in structure and how people want to live post-pandemic, right? So households come from a couple different places, right? There's adults that there's new adults that move out of their parents' house and then need a new home. There's potentially also people that were living with roommates who are now shopping for their own place, which creates a household. It can come from divorce or other sad stories as well. I guess divorce can be happy stories for some people, right?
Well, is that happening? Do we have more people choosing to live on their own, choosing to move, live separately?
Some of it's responding post-pandemic. So during the pandemic, a lot of people started to move in together, either with their family or with roommates to save money, which we see during times of economic stress normally. And some of this is now a reversion back to normal, where people are getting their feet back under them and trying to find a place. All to say that there's a lot of movements in demographics too in the state. And there's some long-run trends that I think are maybe the most concerning things going on in the state right now. Mostly the fact that we are losing young people and we're losing people in general. And as a rule of thumb, if a place is shrinking, it gets more expensive to provide public services and amenities start to disappear and opportunities for commerce, your Nordstroms start to pack up and go. Even if it's not something going on in our own market where they're having issues with profitability here, they may have been making money in Anchorage, but we're just less competitive relative to other places because there's fewer folks up here and higher costs. And those demographic trends bleed into, for instance, difficulty in hiring in labor markets.
I want to... Speaking of that, we're kind of talking about your most recent op-ed, which was about the making Anchorage, Alaska more attractive to young adults.
Yeah. I think it got branded as young professionals. I didn't pick the title, but I think they did a really good job. But I was speaking even about young people in general. Because I think sometimes when people think young professional, they get into the guy wearing khakis and an Oxford and brown shoes who works in finance. And not everybody likes that guy. I like most of those folks, but
Well, and you were talking about young people, period. You were talking about loss of children in our schools.
Yeah, I think so. Obviously, we're talking in the context of ASD is talking about closing 6 schools to save money and still faces a really large budget deficit. And my concern, if we're talking about labor force and ability to attract investment and grow the economy, is basically where are people going and why are they not here? So it's not just the budget deficit that I think is problematic.
Do you know where they're going?
Or 48. So there are
That's an easy answer.
Yeah. So, and actually, it's more complicated than that. So it's not necessarily that more people are leaving than normal. It's that fewer people are moving up to Alaska than historically would. Part of that's because Alaska's economy is counter-cyclical. So normally we attract people up here when our economy is stronger than the lower 48. They come up to make their money in Alaska. And then when the economy in the lower 48 is stronger, people leave to live in warmer weather.
Right.
And I don't know any other reason to move to the lower 48.
Right. And I mean, anecdotally, we all know people who work on the slope but live in California, or work on the slope and live in Colorado. Like literally do these long haul flights every 2 weeks. It's, they make it work.
Yep.
And so their salary is being paid for by Alaskan companies, but their money is being spent at their home of residence, which is not in Alaska.
Absolutely. And so the point I was making in that last op-ed is just that we face two concerns. First, if we're not investing in our kids who are in the state, if we're not educating more children, then we're losing workforce one way, right? If we educate fewer kids, if our kids are less attractive for jobs, they are competing on a global market now for these things, for investment, for firms to locate here. But then the other side is just where are the kids going? Like I said,
Right.
If families are having fewer kids and that's a demographic choice, that's one thing, but often that comes from a sense of economic security, right? One of the discussions people often have before they have children is, can we afford this? And the other side too is, are we just losing young people who are in sort of childbearing or child having that demographic? We've both got kids, right? It's a lot of work. It gets a lot harder as you get older because they keep you busy. And so if we're losing those folks, that's our labor force today. The young professionals, the young workers, the young, person in trades, they're the folks who attract investment and attract companies. And if we're getting less competitive, things just get harder, right? Because as we lose those folks, we attract less investment. There's less economic opportunity up here. That means that more people leave. Our labor force shrinks more. And this becomes a self-reinforcing cycle. I came up with a neat thing for where people move. Originally, I called it LAME, but now I think of it as FAME, which is people often move for family, amenities, money, or education. And if their family's not already up here, or if they're not attached to the military, or the military might draw them up here, or some industry job that draws them up here. I'm up here because my wife is from here. They may move up here for the amenities. They want to live in Alaska. They like skiing. They like hiking. They like biking. They dislike weather above 80 degrees. Right? Those two things aren't going to change. Right? We'll get a steady churn of military folks. We'll get a steady churn of people who love Alaska. But the groups that we might lose, or the groups that we could gain in a positive world, are those who are coming up here for economic opportunity or money, and those who are coming up here for education too. So another influx of 18-year-olds in a lot of places is college education, where you try a place out for 4 years. You want to have an adventure, get away from mom and dad, and then you decide to hang around.
It seems to me like a no-brainer that having a thriving educational system would be attractive to families, to young people. But it seems that there's been a push to cut in those areas. Can we talk a little bit about why we shouldn't be cutting in those areas?
So I think I can talk from personal experience in my department. That we have a really positive story to tell. So we have really strong placements. We get kids into high-profile law schools like Cornell. We've got folks at the London School of Economics. We placed people directly into PhD programs immediately out of undergrad to go, work in industry, work in academia, work in the public sector. And at least at UAA in economics and in the business school more broadly, right, we've got these great stories, and I don't know that we've told them as well as we can, I guess, because I sometimes hear people who are unaware that basically there's this $5 bill sitting on the ground. And so I think more clearly tying where labor force comes from, where our alumni go and the cool things that they're doing, to the fact that, this is a result of the faculty and the administration and the university working together to produce this product is maybe something that people are missing. And I agree. I mean, I think there's also sometimes this perspective that we talk about developing labor force. You ever play Age of Empires as a kid?
I did not.
Okay, so it's this real-time strategy game where if you need a number of workers, you click the number of workers, and then you wait some time and it generates the workers, and then you go tell them you're gonna cut trees. And the little guy just walks back and forth between the trees and the lumber yard and just cuts the trees and stores them. And people think sometimes about labor force development as that. And that makes sense if you've got a finite number of jobs and you're trying to fill them. But if you're trying to develop labor force and attract investment, what you really want is a bunch of those workers just hanging around and let somebody else figure out what to tell them to do. And so this is where I think the other side of attracting people to Alaska to go to school here, or to attract people from Alaska to stay here and go to school is useful for the state, because then there's just this pool of 20-somethings, 30-somethings, folks who have come back to school, so non-traditional students who have these credentials, and they're looking for jobs. Mm-hmm. And companies look at that and they go, there's a big pool of people in Fairbanks, there's a big pool of people in Anchorage, there's a big pool of people in Juneau who have these skills, and I can open a branch there. Mm-hmm. I can hire some of those engineers, or some of those folks go, the jobs I want aren't here, but I've got an idea and I'll start a company. And hey, I know 3 or 4 other people that are graduating at the same time who can help me run it. And so you focus on that sort of chaotic creation, not catastrophic, or not this sort of pool of just, there's people who are here, they're motivated, they want to be here, and they're going to create opportunity or attract opportunity. Mm-hmm. And I think that sometimes that takes an act of faith in mm-hmm. sort of the free market, that mm-hmm. We don't need to identify where the jobs are right now. If we have the people with the skills, the jobs will arrive, mm-hmm. especially with the increases in remote work and stuff like that, right? Somebody could potentially graduate from the system, decide they want to stay in Alaska and get a remote job mm-hmm. and stay in the state. And then we have the opposite of the issue with the fly in, fly out crew.
Right. You could have people living here but collecting their salary from Colorado. Exactly.
Mm-hmm. And that's not a bad game to be in. Mm-hmm. I know a lot of people who come up here, they visit and they go, I'd love to live in Alaska. I need to find a job that can let me stay.
Yeah. And, I'll just bring it up because, I think most people, will check out home prices in other places, fantasize about, it's so expensive here. But actually, home prices are really high everywhere. Yeah. And maybe not everywhere, but most places that people want to move to from here, if you start looking, you're like, you know what? Maybe I'll just stay where I am.
Well, I think one of the underlying drivers is NIMBYism, right? And that's everywhere. If everybody doesn't know what NIMBYism is, it's not in my backyard. So it's often talked about with anything that has like a negative externality or any sort of development that's difficult. So it's not just housing. Mm-hmm. People don't want hospitals or whatever in their backyard because they don't want the traffic. Mm-hmm. But this shows up in housing a lot, where people will argue for zoning rules and restrictions on who can build and what can be built. Never because they're against development or more housing. Always because they're against that project.
Right.
Because that specific project doesn't address enough concerns. Mm-hmm. And so we add hoops and barriers and other things to stop development, not because we're against mm-hmm. development in general, but because this one project that will impact me is bad. Mm-hmm. And that makes housing expensive everywhere, right? Because no neighborhood that is zoned for single families wants to allow multifamily housing in it, because that might impact their property values. Even if it doesn't, it changes. There's all sorts of trigger words I can use that anybody who's annoyed at NIMBYs already, it'll make them frustrated, right? It'll change the character of the neighborhood.
Well, like the rich liberal trump card is to suddenly be concerned about a particular species of frog, or specific. They're like, oh, you can't build an apartment complex there because there's a rare frog, or a rare small, tiny, amphibian that might live there, and all of a sudden, this person who's never heard of that before, goes on a crusade to save this particular small animal
who's maybe spraying pesticide in their backyard to kill those frogs.
Oh, exactly. Yeah, but that's kind of like a surefire trump card, is that you get sort of, well, you're an environmental economist, tying into your lane,
and I think even the broader ones, right? Like I was reading a story about Berkeley where people were arguing against population growth as a way to bring down housing prices in Berkeley, and the truth is, no, it's just that there's not enough density, and there's a big university there, mm-hmm. and students want to live off campus. Mm-hmm. And the answer is just build some apartment buildings. Mm-hmm. But people don't want things to change. I think that's as old as humanity itself. And so NIMBYism kind of pops up and stops these developments. And it's always, if folks are interested, they can cruise through a lot of those old stories and pretty quickly see the same themes pop up. Some environmental impact that can't possibly be mediated. It'll change the character. It's not truly affordable. Mm-hmm. On and on and on.
So I sent you some questions in advance, and they were pretty sort of broad, general questions. But I'll just ask and see if there's any, if you want to go to someplace new from here. But, what do you see as the biggest issues in the Anchorage economy today?
The Anchorage economy today, right? I lean on the population issue. I think that we can very well trust our private business leaders and stuff to figure out how to make money. I think we've got a lot of very smart people who want to invest in this state, who are looking for opportunities. I think what we need to do is make sure that there is a workforce and a quality of life that attracts people up here so that the ability to invest exists. And I think that's affordable housing, affordable childcare, quality education, quality parks. And I think the neat thing about a lot of those solutions is I don't know anybody who's running against good schools or nice parks. I think everybody kind of agrees those are issues, but that we need to figure out solutions to them. And I think that everybody can kind of see it.
Right. So one of your op-eds talked about the need for additional revenue. If we're going to have, well, and I guess maybe you have a different idea, but when I hear like need for childcare, need for education, I think need for more state investment in childcare, in public education.
Yeah. So in that thing, I'm kind of pointing at something that's not my original idea. Mm-hmm. So Scott Goldsmith and others had talked for years and years and years about what they call the Alaska disconnect. Mm-hmm. The folks at Alaskans for Sustainable Budgets, I think on Twitter, pointed out that I was just rehashing something. A new generation discovers an old idea. Mm-hmm. The basic idea, though, is this, that revenues in Alaska are detached from population. There is a finite number of money to go around right now. And the more people who are up here, the more finely it's distributed, which means that per capita spending on things necessarily goes down in total as more people are up here because there's no connection between revenues and population. Mm-hmm. Now, you could argue, well, maybe population goes up when revenues go up and then population goes down when revenues go down. That's not really great, right? Because it's getting at that same issue in that there's always going to be a cap in the types of amenities Alaska can offer. That doesn't come from the demand for those amenities. It comes from oil prices and the performance of the permanent fund. Right. And so
it's the stock market and oil.
Yep, that's what gives us our money to pay for schools, roads, troopers, and everything else. And so if the stock market is down, if oil prices are down, we have to have fewer services unless we have new revenues. Mm-hmm. And so I do think it's a discussion that the state needs to have about what sources of revenue we have, if there's new ones we can tap, and if there's a way to connect revenue to the total population. Mm-hmm. Obviously, there's the direction that people can jump to that taxes are a natural way to do that an income tax or a sales tax or a property tax is directly tied to the number of people who have property or buy stuff or have an income. But I think that there's other ways that you could also work to try and tie the draw on the permanent fund or something to population that I have not spent a ton of time thinking through, but I think policymakers can have those discussions and certainly lean on economists around the state, folks who are smarter than me and the other folks too, to think about those trade-offs that we face. But I think as long as population is completely divorced from revenues, we're always going to face what an economist would think of as a negative feedback, which is the state will eventually reach such a size that it's not an attractive place to look at or to move to. Or an attractive place to stay because crime will go up, schools will get worse.
Well, the conservative argument would be that will always be attractive to people who don't like taxes because we don't have a state income tax, we don't have a sales tax.
I think that's a fair argument, right? I think there are people who have that perspective where it's their number one choice. I think that the thing to also consider on top of it too, is what kind of a state are we building, and are people truly telling us that that's the only thing they care about? Mm-hmm. Do we really believe that the folks who tell us that all they care about is not paying taxes don't like roads without potholes? Or everybody likes firefighters and police. Everybody likes roads, and so I think that some of this is policy preferences, and there's trade-offs to be had.
I mean, I would say that in this current election cycle, there are candidates who are campaigning on less taxes. They're literally campaigning on less taxes.
Yeah, and I think that this is an interesting issue within the Alaska framework, right? And this is another thing that coming on the outside, I think folks have to learn about, right? Which is this perspective of whether or not Alaska is an ownership state and whether or not the PFD is money given from the state or money held in trust by the state and distributed to people. I came here from Connecticut, like a third of my check disappeared before I got it. So it was a big change to learn about that perspective and figure out how to understand it. And I think that's something that the state has to work through, is figure out if we are, if we have this distribution, like, or do we have revenue from somewhere else that subsidizes that? Do we fit the government in what's left? Do we, all these things I think are going to be hot topics in the legislature until they get settled.
I'm wondering if there's anything that a new legislator could do that would have a real impact on improving Alaska's economy in the short term.
I mean, I think, obviously, as a first-year legislator, if I was talking to one or a prospective one, a lot of the small ball problems sum up to be big things, right? So when we talk about affordable, accessible, quality childcare, when we talk about making it cheaper and easier to build housing, when we talk about figuring out ways to invest in education, or, right, like there's this bipartisan interest in trying to figure out ways to increase quality, even without new revenues. Is there low-hanging fruit that's truly there that can be picked up? Solving a lot of those low-hanging fruit issues where I think there's a lot of consensus and interest can increase quality of life, make this place more attractive for people to stay and to move to, and help solve some of those workforce issues. And I think that's the place where there's the most room maybe to do something positive. But I'm not on the political side. I see these as economic issues that I don't see clear partisan lines that would stop collaboration or work on. The politics may be very different, and I'm a novice. I have the same information as anybody who reads the ADN every other day on that stuff.
So you have an upcoming speaker series.
We do.
Do you want to talk about that?
Yeah, so myself, Alex James, and Hannah Hennighausen are going to be giving talks at the Writer's Block. So this was motivated actually by a Twitter interaction where this person, was talking about Reagan or something and how we were too conservative, which is fun because if you follow my Twitter, like every other week I get labeled too conservative, and then the other week I'm too liberal, and then just people are mad at me in general all the time. I kind of get bullied on the internet, I guess, but I think I give as good as I get, so I'm not complaining. But we decided that it'd be useful to go out and have conversations and just talk about the research that we do because people might be interested. So I'll be talking about some work I'm doing with ecological and economic thresholds and fisheries management, and just thresholds in general. So most of my research in the past has focused on theory in economic systems where sudden changes can happen, and those changes aren't reversible. It's kind of easy to go forward and hard to go back. So some of it was on emerging infectious disease. I wrote my dissertation on trying to prevent pandemics, where obviously once a pandemic starts, it's a lot harder to start than if you make investments beforehand. And now I'm working on some stuff about coastal communities and fisheries. Alex is going to talk about some of his work on the political economy of resource-rich locations. If Alex is listening to this, I'm probably botching his research. But he's looked in the past a lot about the impacts of resource discoveries and resource development on where people live, on crime rates, on politics and stuff in different locations. And then Hannah's going to talk about the history of flood insurance in the United States and disaster insurance. So she's an expert on flood insurance and sort of risk as well. We're all targeting about 20 to 30-minute talks with hopefully an active question and answer session afterwards, and then we'll hang out just to talk economics with whoever happens to be interested. The first one is going to be on November 10th at 6 p.m. I'm getting the flyer.
Is that a Thursday?
Afterwards. Yep, Thursday at 6.
So Thursday after Election Day.
Yeah, I didn't think about that. Shoot. So
that's fine.
Hopefully people are still into economics after the election. But yeah, and so we thought it would be a neat way to kind of share what we're doing with the community. We've obviously got a bunch of research active people who are publishing well and have a lot to say on these topics. And it's just fun for us to get new questions. You never know what's going to come up.
I think it's great.
Yeah.
So I'm glad you're doing it.
Thanks.
And last question that we ask of everybody on the podcast, can you recommend a book to our listeners?
The book that I read most recently that stuck out to me was probably 1 Billion Americans by Matt Yglesias. So I think it's super interesting because Matt and I agree on some things and we disagree on a lot of other things. But I think the issue of how do we have a place that is nice, people want to live, and has a growing population is one that people should be discussing. To me, it comes from two different directions. And this is where I agree with Matt. First, from sort of pro-family policies. So making it easier to raise kids, educate kids, get your kids in childcare so that you can.
You have 3 kids and you're expecting a 4th.
We've got two and a third on the way.
You have 2 and a third of them.
Yeah. So I am paying for childcare.
Yeah.
And I am dealing with the difficulty of getting 3 kids in the same childcare because all of ours are not yet in elementary school, and it is not easy. And then the other side is Matt is very pro-immigration as well. And I think that's a very interesting point of how can we attract talented, motivated people here who want to be a part of society and get jobs and grow the state and grow the country and do good things for the United States and for Alaska. And I think that those 2 policy questions are maybe the most important when we're thinking about competing both with the other states in America, right? We compete with the other 49 for population and investment and everything else, but competing internationally, particularly with countries that are not our friends, like China and Russia. And if we think about making America a thriving place, what kind of policies can we do that make it easier to have a family, to invest and to grow and be successful and prosperous, right? Because in the end, I think in theory, that's what all of y'all politicians are always arguing about, is how to make life better for all of us. And so, we should have those conversations.
Right. I think I read somewhere the definition of politics, and I'm going to totally get it wrong, but something that if everybody had everything they wanted all the time, there would be no need for politics. Basically, politics is figuring out how to distribute limited resources, or, basically how to divvy up what is not unlimited.
I think so. And maybe I'm an odd duck, right? But I've taken the perspective, especially in the last couple of years, that I'm really watching a bunch of my neighbors argue about who can do the best to help each other, right? If politics is functional, right, y'all are really arguing about who is going to make everybody else the happiest. And so you're arguing with your competitor right now about whether or not you can make their family safer and more prosperous as a leader, right? Obviously, they're best within their own family, but as a political leader, if you can help them the most or more than they can help you, which I think is a positive space to be in, an argument we should be having more explicitly more often, which is we're trying to work together and that we're on the same team.
Well, hypothetically speaking, of course, I think there's sometimes a difference between opponents as to who the actual constituents are. In other words, thinking that most people in a particular area have a decent paying job, have decent access to the school that they want their kids to go to, or thinking, we've got people who aren't making enough money, who are at risk of losing their home, who are potentially going to have the school that their children go to closed, and so more of seeing it as we're on the verge of crisis and we need to do something big. If you don't see that, if you think, no, you know what, most of my folks are doing just fine, we're going to continue things as they are, then, that sometimes it's not so much a difference in ideas, it's a difference in what's needed. You literally are seeing 2 different audiences, 2 different populations.
I think that is a good point too, that one of the great things about our system is that we can wind up with folks, right, who can make sure that people are heard. And I think you bring a good point that, particularly in our experiences in Alaska and even in Anchorage, right, we're often not members of every community and we don't see everything. And it's very important that people are engaged in this stuff and that we actually hear from everybody. So, I write an op-ed, whatever, once every 2 or 3 months when something particularly grinds my gears, and everybody gets to see what Kevin has to say if they care. If they don't, they don't. But I think more engagement and hearing from more people is a good reason or a good thing from exactly this. So one of the things that I've been really interested in this go-round is ranked choice of voting and sort of the strategy and the politics. The strategy within the politics of ranked choice of voting, right? So I'm interested in it as a game, like game theory, where you've got 2 sides who are competing against each other. And in a traditional election, right, they're just trying to either fire up their base or attract new voters from each other, potentially new voters from people who don't vote. And now we've changed it to where we've got up to 4 people competing against each other, trying to draw voters both from folks who aren't already voting and fire up their existing bases, but trying to attract voters from the support of other candidates who are out there and actively running against them. And I think it's a really interesting game, and it's been, at least academically, really intellectually stimulating to think about how that changes potentially the strategies too going forward.
Right.
Where potentially candidates being able to speak, at least in elections where there's more than two people running, being able to speak to the voters of other people, I think is going to be increasingly important if we keep ranked choice voting.
I'll just end by saying you wrote an interesting op-ed in August about ranked choice voting, where you encourage people to rank everybody.
Yep.
You want people to take full advantage of the ranked choice voting system, and if you're only voting for one person, you're not, and rank all the way up.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, so you don't have to rank the fourth person because by definition, by ranking three people, you've ranked the fourth. You can do it because it's just easier. It's easier messaging.
It's fun sometimes to purposely give someone last place.
You're my least favorite.
Yes.
Yeah. But I do think in the long run, if we make ranked choice voting work, we can wrap that up, it changes the incentives for elected leaders that now, particularly once they get past the primary, which I don't think we're going to have 49 people in every primary going forward. I think that was that specific election, right? Like you wind up with debates where people have to be nice to each other, right? Where they don't want to draw stark divides between each other, where they might want to find a little bit of consensus. And so we wind up with these situations where, for instance, Les Guerra and Bill Walker just released a joint ad together, which is kind of strange for this point in an election to be doing that. They have an incentive to try and build sort of a common base. They're still competing with each other. And we see the same thing, I think, in the House election, where Sarah Palin and Nick Begich are obviously still attacking each other and going after each other, as you do in an election, but are also pushing the message of rank the red and trying to build a common base and point out that we're very different, but we're not that different, right? Like there's a stark divide between us, but we're on the same side. And I think the longer that this works, there's room for being creative in these elections and trying to build broader bases. For instance, Mary Peltola, I think, has done a good job of being very sort of having a very broad base of support, right? Of being pro-resource development, but pro-choice, and that we see sort of these interesting strategies even now starting to evolve out of it, where I've been hearing political ads and everybody seems to be pushing how bipartisan they've been in the past, which I think is very interesting. That now people are starting
now
to
all of a sudden being bipartisan is a plus.
Exactly.
Whereas before you would be punished for having voted for, if you were a Republican, voting with a Democratic policy or, Yeah,
and I mean, obviously, right, like there's different voting systems that come to slightly different outcomes and have different incentives. And so if your motivation seems to be more bipartisanship and more policy with broader support, maybe ranked choice voting in the long run is going to prove to be better. If you care more about party orthodoxy and sticking with sort of a set of principles that comes from the party, the more traditional election system might work better. But I think that it's interesting now to watch this experimentation come through. And that if we follow those incentives from my op-ed, I think we're basically encouraging people to provide the best possible incentives to future candidates.
Right.
So I've heard a lot, just finishing this point, I've seen a lot of folks say, I can't possibly vote for X, or everybody in the other party is the same to me. And I don't think that's true, and I don't think people mean it. I think that a lot of folks are very attached to their identity, which they've made their set of political beliefs, their set of core beliefs. And I respect that, and it's a valuable thing. That
like a religion.
Do. Yeah, I'm religious, so I understand this. At the same time, I think that it's worth pointing out that you're setting incentives in the future for the next round of candidates too. And as a voter, when you tell a candidate that there's no way you can ever get my vote, what you're also telling them is never spend any effort on me, right? Like I'm a waste of your dollars and it's not worth coming to talk to me at my door. You don't need to hear from me because I'll never vote for you. And that's a strategy on the voter's side. But the other strategy is to say, I'm willing to talk to anybody, I'm willing to hear you out, and you know what? I may vote for you third instead of fourth, and that may win you an election. But at least hear out what I have to say and hear my concerns. And I think that is a perk from ranked choice voting that we would see evolve and show up in the future, right? We're starting to see it in this election. But if that becomes the way that you win, good politicians win elections. And they'll respond to the change in incentives.
Well, I'll just end by saying the posters or signs that you see around town that are pro-fish, Lisa Murkowski, Mary Peltola. They're on Tudor right now. As you leave, you might see one.
Yeah. I've seen some odd combinations.
Well, I just
People are
think if
representing
we
all
weren't
three parties.
doing
Yeah.
if we weren't doing ranked choice voting, I don't think you would see that Republican Democrat on the same sign.
Absolutely. I've seen also two candidates within the same election on people's lawns,
Uh-huh.
right? Like a Walker Dunleavy or a Walker Guerra. Like,
Oh.
very interesting combinations that, like, again, I think that's people doing, I think, what I was suggesting. I assumed most people would do this to begin with. But going through and saying, okay, I've got a menu of options, and I'm not a diehard of any group. Like, let's rank who I like.
Yeah, it's going to be interesting. Hey, Kevin Berry, thank you so much for being on the show today.
Yeah, thank you for having me. It's a lot of fun.
Yeah.
Big thanks to Corey Coolidge for making this podcast listenable. Please check out his website, anchoragelife.net, and his YouTube channel, also called Anchorage Life. And thank you to you, our listeners. If you like what you heard, please subscribe, rate, and review us. Next week, Anchorage-based environmental planner and climatologist Brian Brettschneider. Please tune in.